There are moments in a courtroom when time seems to stop. When every person in that room, the judge, the attorneys, the observers in the gallery, realizes they're witnessing something extraordinary. Something that transcends legal arguments and case precedents and procedural rules. On November 14, 2023, in Family Court Division 7 in Portland, Oregon, that moment came when a 10-year-old boy named Ethan Matthews walked to the witness stand, placed his small hand on a Bible that was almost as big as his torso, and swore to tell the truth. What he said in the next 12 minutes would not only determine the fate of his 14-year-old sister, but would expose a broken foster care system, reveal the extraordinary resilience of children who've survived trauma, and remind everyone in that courtroom why they'd chosen careers in family law in the first place. This is the story of Ethan Matthews, the little boy who refused to let the system separate him from his sister, and the testimony that changed more than just one court case. This is about courage, love, and what happens when a child becomes the most powerful voice in a room full of adults. To understand why Ethan Matthews was testifying in family court at age 10, you need to understand where his family started and how it fell apart. The Matthews family, David, Michelle, their daughter Sophie, and son Ethan, looked like a typical middle-class American family from the outside. David worked as a software engineer. Michelle was a nurse. They lived in a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet Portland suburb. Sophie played soccer. Ethan loved building with Legos. They were the kind of family that neighbors waved to, that attended school functions, that seemed to have it all together. But behind closed doors, a different reality was unfolding. One that would eventually land them in family court with their children's futures hanging in the balance. David Matthews struggled with alcohol addiction for most of his adult life. It started as social drinking in college, progressed to daily beers after work, and eventually escalated to a dependency that affected every aspect of his life. Michelle, meanwhile, had her own demons, a prescription painkiller addiction that began after a car accident when Sophie was 8 years old. What started as legitimate pain management became something darker, something that consumed her life and her ability to parent. For years, they hid their addictions from their children, from their employers, from their friends. They were functional addicts, the kind that slip through the cracks because they still show up to work, still pay their bills, still maintain the appearance of normalcy. But addiction doesn't stay hidden forever. Sophie, the older child, became what child welfare experts call a parentified child, a kid forced to take on adult responsibilities because the actual adults can't function. By age 12, she was making sure her little brother got to school on time, packing his lunches, helping with homework, and tucking him in at night. She learned to navigate her parents' moods, to know when her father's drinking would turn angry, to recognize when her mother was too impaired to be trusted. She became Ethan's protector, his parent in all but name. And Ethan, who was just a little kid trying to understand why his parents slept so much and why his sister always seemed worried, trusted Sophie completely. She was his world. The breaking point came on March 3, 2023, when Michelle was arrested for driving under the influence with both children in the car. She'd picked them up from school, taken her pills in the parking lot, and driven approximately half a mile before swerving into oncoming traffic and causing a minor collision. Nobody was seriously injured, but the police report was damning. The children were found in the back seat, terrified and crying. Sophie had been holding Ethan, trying to shield him during the impact. And Michelle had been so impaired that she couldn't remember her own address when the officers asked. Child Protective Services was called immediately. By that evening, Sophie and Ethan Matthews were removed from their home and placed in emergency foster care. David, when he learned what had happened, made the situation worse. He showed up at the foster home intoxicated, demanding his children back, and had to be removed by police. Within 48 hours, both parents had been ordered to complete substance abuse treatment and supervised visitation only. Within a week, the court had scheduled a hearing to determine whether parental rights should be terminated entirely. And Sophie and Ethan Matthews found themselves trapped in a system that, despite its best intentions, was about to tear them apart in a way their parents' addiction never had. The first foster placement lasted 3 weeks. Sophie and Ethan were placed together in the home of Maria and Robert Carson, an experienced foster couple who'd been taking in children for over a decade. It should have been a good fit. The Carsons had a comfortable home, clear rules, and genuine care for the children in their custody. But Sophie, traumatized by the sudden loss of her parents and hypervigilant about protecting her brother, struggled with the transition. She had panic attacks. She refused to leave Ethan's side. She challenged every rule, tested every boundary, and made it clear through her behavior that she didn't trust any adult to keep them safe. The Carsons, experienced as they were, found themselves overwhelmed by a 14-year-old girl whose trauma manifested as aggression and a 10-year-old boy who clung to his sister like she was the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved around him. After 3 weeks, the Carsons made a request that would set off a chain of events leading to that courtroom. They asked that Sophie be placed elsewhere, but that they be allowed to keep Ethan. They argued that Sophie's behavioral issues were preventing Ethan from adjusting, that the siblings' codependent relationship was unhealthy, and that both children would be better served by separate placements where they could heal independently. The caseworker pressed for foster homes and dealing with overcrowded caseloads agreed. A hearing was scheduled to determine whether the siblings should be separated, and nobody asked Ethan what he thought about losing the only family he had left. The attorney assigned to represent Sophie and Ethan's interests was a woman named Rebecca Chen, a 34-year-old public defender who'd gone into family law because she believed children deserved advocates who actually fought for them. She'd seen hundreds of cases like this, siblings separated because it was easier for the system, because foster families wanted the easier child, because budgets and bed availability mattered more than keeping families together. And she'd fought against those separations every time because she understood something that the system often forgot. Trauma doesn't heal in isolation. Children who've lost their parents don't heal by losing their siblings, too. Rebecca's first meeting with Sophie took place in a supervised visitation room at the Child Protective Services office. Sophie sat with her arms crossed, her expression hard, her entire posture radiating distrust. She'd already been through 3 different caseworkers, 2 different foster homes, and countless adults who'd promised things they didn't deliver. She had no reason to believe Rebecca would be any different. But Rebecca didn't start with legal questions or case strategy. Sophie's answer was immediate and fierce. "I want my brother. That's all I want." Her voice cracked on Ethan's name, the hard exterior fracturing just enough to reveal the terrified child underneath. "He's all I have. I'm all he has. We've already lost our parents." Rebecca asked Sophie to explain what role she'd played in Ethan's life before the removal. And what emerged from that conversation was a picture of a young girl who'd been raising her brother since she was barely old enough to care for herself. Sophie described making breakfast before school, walking Ethan to the bus stop, checking his homework, reading him bedtime stories when their parents were too incapacitated to care. She described the nights when their father's drinking turned violent, and she'd lock herself and Ethan in her bedroom, creating pillow forts and telling him stories to drown out the shouting. She described the mornings she'd wake him early to get him ready for school because their mother was passed out on the couch, and how she'd find ways to protect him from the truth while still being honest enough that he trusted her. "I know I'm not perfect," Sophie said, tears finally breaking through. "I know I have problems. I'm angry all the time. I don't trust anyone. I don't sleep. But Ethan trusts me. When everything else in his world fell apart, I was the one thing that stayed solid. And now they want to take that away from him because I'm difficult? Because I won't just smile and pretend everything is fine? I'm difficult because I had to be a parent when I was still a child. I'm difficult because I'm the only one who protected him." What she found instead was a little boy with an old soul who understood far more than anyone gave him credit for. Ethan sat in that same visitation room, his feet barely touching the floor, his hands folded in his lap, and he looked at Rebecca with eyes that had seen too much for 10 years. When Rebecca asked him how he was adjusting to the foster home, Ethan's response was polite but pointed. "It's fine. The Carsons are nice." Rebecca, following her training, asked Ethan why he wanted to stay with his sister. Was he afraid of being alone? Did he worry about what would happen to Sophie without him? Was he just uncomfortable with change? These were the standard questions designed to assess whether a child's preference was based on genuine need or simple resistance to transition. Ethan's answer stopped Rebecca in her tracks. "Sophie kept me safe when nobody else did. Now she needs me to keep her safe." For a 10-year-old to articulate that level of understanding about reciprocal care, about the mutual nature of protection, about family obligation, it wasn't what Rebecca expected. She asked Ethan to explain what he meant, and what followed was a 20-minute conversation that would form the backbone of Rebecca's entire legal strategy. Ethan described, in careful detail appropriate for his age, how Sophie had taken care of him. He talked about the lunches she packed, the homework help, the bedtime stories. But more than that, he talked about the emotional labor she'd performed, comforting him when he was scared, explaining things when he was confused, being consistent when everything else was chaos. And then he said something that Rebecca would quote in her court filings. "Sophie saved me from being more broken. Now everyone thinks she's the broken one, but she's not. She's just tired from carrying all the weight. If they take her away from me, she'll think nobody wants her." Rebecca knew then that she had to put Ethan on the stand. It was risky. Children his age rarely testified in family court because the experience can be traumatic, and their reliability as witnesses is often questioned. But Ethan wasn't a typical child. He was articulate, thoughtful, and possessed an understanding of his family dynamics that exceeded his years. More importantly, he was the only person who could truly explain what Sophie meant to him and what separation would cost them both. Rebecca filed a motion requesting that Ethan be allowed to testify at the hearing regarding sibling separation. The Carsons' attorney objected, arguing that putting a child through the stress of testimony was harmful, and that the adults in the room were better equipped to determine the children's best interests. But Judge Margaret Walsh, a veteran of family court who'd presided over thousands of cases involving children, approved the motion with one stipulation. Ethan would testify in chambers rather than open court, with only essential personnel present to minimize stress. The hearing was scheduled for November 14th, 2023. Rebecca spent hours preparing Ethan, not coaching him on what to say, that would be unethical, but preparing him for what to expect. She explained that the judge would ask him questions, that other adults in the room might ask him questions too, that he should tell the truth, even if that truth was hard to say, that nobody would be angry with him for being honest. Ethan listened carefully to all of this, and when Rebecca asked if he understood, he said something that made her believe they had a chance. "I understand. I just have to tell them what Sophie means to me." November 14th arrived with the gray drizzle that characterizes Portland autumns. The hearing was scheduled for 2 p.m. in Judge Walsh's chambers. Present in the room, Judge Walsh herself, now 58 years old and weathered by decades of making impossible decisions about children's lives. Rebecca Chen, clutching a file folder containing Ethan's school records, psychological evaluations, and case notes. The Carsons' attorney, a efficient woman named Patricia Morrison, who genuinely believed separation was in both children's best interests. A court reporter to document every word. A child advocate assigned by the court to provide an independent assessment. And Sophie, who'd been allowed to attend because the hearing directly concerned her, sitting in a chair against the wall with tears already streaming down her face before anything had even begun. Ethan was brought in by a caseworker at 2:03 p.m. He wore a button-up shirt that Sophie had helped him pick out that morning during their supervised visitation. She told him he should look professional for court, and he'd taken that instruction seriously. His hair was carefully combed, his shoes were tied. He looked like a little boy playing dress-up in adult clothes, except his expression betrayed the gravity of what he understood was at stake. The caseworker guided him to the witness chair, and Judge Walsh asked everyone to sit. The room settled into the particular kind of quiet that precedes moments that everyone senses will be significant. Judge Walsh began with gentle questions designed to put Ethan at ease and establish his competency as a witness. She asked him his name, his age, his birthday. She asked if he understood what it meant to tell the truth. Ethan answered each question clearly. "My name is Ethan James Matthews. I'm 10 years old. My birthday is June 12th. That last answer made Judge Walsh's eyebrows rise slightly. That was a sophisticated understanding for a child his age, and it suggested that whatever came next would be worth hearing. Rebecca Chen stood and approached Ethan with a supportive smile. The specificity of that answer revealed how carefully he'd been counting every moment of separation from his normal life. Ethan nodded, then remembered to speak aloud for the record. "Yes. We were together at the Carsons' house for 3 weeks. This was the tricky part. Ethan could have said no and seemed ungrateful. He could have said yes and seemed fine with the separation. But his answer navigated the complexity perfectly. "The Carsons are nice people. They give me good food and help with my homework. But it's not home." The simplicity and clarity of that statement hung in the air. Even Patricia Morrison, the attorney arguing for separation, looked uncomfortable. And here's where Ethan took everyone by surprise. Instead of listing reasons or explaining logistics, he told a story. He described a night about a year before they were removed from their parents' home, a night when their father came home drunk and started throwing things. Ethan had been 7 years old, terrified, hiding in his room. Sophie, who was 11 at the time, came to his room, locked the door, and built a fort out of blankets and pillows. She turned on a flashlight and read him his favorite book, Where the Wild Things Are, and she did all the voices, making him laugh, even though he could hear their father shouting in the living room. When Ethan asked if they were safe, Sophie told him, "As long as we're together, we're safe." "That's what Sophie does," Ethan continued, his voice steady despite the emotion in the room. "She keeps me safe. Not just from bad stuff happening, but from feeling scared of bad stuff. When I'm with her, I know everything will be okay." The metaphor was so visceral, so precise, that the court reporter's fingers paused on the keys for just a moment. Judge Walsh, who'd been listening without expression, leaned forward slightly. "Ethan, the Carsons have said they can provide you with a stable home, good education, and opportunities." It was a hard question, the kind that cut to the heart of the legal argument about best interests. Ethan thought about it for a moment, his 10-year-old brain working through complex concepts about family and belonging and what it means to be home. His answer would be quoted in family law journals for years afterward. "Because they don't know me. They don't know that I have nightmares about my parents, and the only person who can calm me down is Sophie. They don't know that I count to 17 when I'm scared because that's what Sophie taught me to do. They don't know that I don't like the sound of ice clinking in glasses because it reminds me of my dad's drinking. Sophie knows all of that. Sophie knows me, and I know her. I know that she's scared people will give up on her. I know that she's sad even when she pretends not to be. I know that she needs me as much as I need her. The Carsons can give me things." The room was silent. Patricia Morrison, the attorney who'd been prepared to argue that separation would benefit both children, closed her notebook. One of the observers in the back of the room was openly crying, and Sophie, sitting against the wall, had buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Judge Walsh asked for a brief recess, and during those 10 minutes, Rebecca Chen would later say she knew they'd won. You can't argue against that kind of love. You can't present evidence that refutes a child's understanding of what family means. When the hearing reconvened, Patricia Morrison surprised everyone by withdrawing the Carsons' request for sole placement of Ethan. She stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, after hearing this testimony, I believe the best interests of both children are served by keeping them together." It was an extraordinary concession, and it came from a place of recognition that sometimes the law has to bend to the reality of human bonds that transcend legal definitions of family. But Judge Walsh wasn't finished with Ethan yet. It was a brilliant question because it flipped the narrative. Instead of Ethan being the vulnerable child who needed protection, it acknowledged that Sophie needed him too, that their relationship was reciprocal. Ethan's answer demonstrated wisdom far beyond his years. She needs to know that someone won't give up on her just because she's having a hard time. Everyone sees her behavior problems, but I see my sister who saved me over and over. Judge Walsh ruled from the bench, unusual in family court where decisions typically come in written orders days or weeks later. I find that these siblings have a bond that has been essential to their survival through extremely difficult circumstances. Separating them at this time would cause significant harm to both children, particularly to Sophie, who has demonstrated attachment and protective behaviors toward her brother, and to Ethan, who has articulated a clear understanding of his sister's emotional needs and his role in meeting them. She paused, looked directly at Ethan, and added something judges rarely say. "Thank you for your courage today, Ethan." Finding a foster placement that could accommodate both a traumatized teenage girl with behavioral issues and her 10-year-old brother proved challenging, but not impossible. 3 weeks after the hearing, Sophie and Ethan were placed with the Johnsons, Linda and Marcus Johnson, a couple in their 50s who'd raised 3 biological children and specialized in taking sibling groups with complex trauma. Linda was a retired school counselor. Marcus was a social worker. They'd been through extensive trauma-informed care training. And crucially, they understood that Sophie's difficult behavior wasn't defiance, it was survival. The first month was rough. Sophie tested every boundary, expected rejection, and struggled to believe that the Johnsons would keep their word about not separating her from Ethan. But slowly, with consistent support and therapy, things began to shift. Sophie started attending school regularly. Her grades improved. She joined a support group for teens who'd experienced parental substance abuse. And most importantly, she began to trust that she didn't have to be Ethan's only protector anymore, that there were adults who could share that responsibility without taking it away from her entirely. Ethan thrived in the Johnson home. With Sophie more stable, he felt safe enough to actually be a 10-year-old kid again. He joined a soccer team. He made friends at school. He still had nightmares occasionally, but Linda taught him additional coping strategies beyond counting to 17. And every night, Sophie would still come to his room before bed, not to protect him from immediate danger anymore, but to maintain that connection, to remind both of them that they were still together, still family, still Sophie and Ethan, even though everything else had changed. The video of Ethan's testimony, not the official court recording, but a description of what happened, was shared by Rebecca Chen at a family law conference 6 months after the hearing. It became part of training materials for attorneys, caseworkers, and judges about the importance of listening to children's voices in family court. Academic papers were written analyzing Ethan's testimony and its implications for sibling placement decisions. And the case became a reference point in Oregon family law. Matthews stands for the principle that sibling bonds formed through shared trauma can be just as essential to a child's well-being as physical safety and material provision. David and Michelle Matthews, the parents whose addiction had set this entire tragedy in motion, followed very different paths. Michelle completed a substance abuse treatment program and has been in recovery for over a year. She has supervised visits with her children twice a month. The relationship is slowly rebuilding, though Sophie remains cautious and Ethan is still working through his feelings about his mother's choices. David, unfortunately, was unable to maintain sobriety. His parental rights were eventually terminated after multiple relapses and failures to complete court-ordered treatment. He sends birthday cards that Sophie reads but doesn't respond to, and Ethan keeps in a drawer he rarely opens. Sophie turned 16 in the Johnson home. For her birthday, Linda and Marcus threw her a party, the first birthday party she'd had in years. Friends from school came, there was cake, there were presents. But the moment that mattered most came at the end of the night when Ethan gave Sophie his present, a photo album he'd put together with help from Linda. It contained pictures from their childhood, photos Linda had retrieved from their case file and helped Ethan organize chronologically. On the first page, Ethan had written in his careful 10-year-old handwriting, "To Sophie, this is us. No matter what happens, this is always us. Thank you for being my family." Sophie cried harder than anyone had seen her cry since the removal. But this time they were different tears, not tears of trauma or fear or grief, but tears of relief. Relief that someone saw her not as a problem to be managed, but as a sister who'd sacrificed her own childhood to protect her brother. Relief that Ethan understood what she'd done for him. Relief that their story, which had been heading toward separation and loss, had somehow found its way to hope. Ethan's testimony sparked conversations that extended far beyond one courtroom in Portland, Oregon. Child welfare advocates across the country began citing the Matthews case as evidence that the foster care system needed to prioritize sibling placement more aggressively. Statistics were compiled showing that separated siblings have worse outcomes than those kept together. Higher rates of behavioral problems, lower educational achievement, increased likelihood of mental health issues, and greater difficulty forming healthy relationships in adulthood. The research had been there for years, but Ethan's testimony gave it a human face that couldn't be ignored. Oregon legislators introduced a bill requiring that any decision to separate siblings in foster care must include consideration of the children's stated preferences and testimony when appropriate. The bill, informally known as Ethan's Law, passed with bipartisan support in 2024. It mandates that caseworkers must document specific, compelling reasons for sibling separation, that children over age 8 must be given the opportunity to express their views on placement decisions, and that judges must make explicit findings about why separation is necessary if they choose to override a child's preference to remain with siblings. Similar legislation has been introduced in 6 other states, all citing the Matthews case as inspiration. The training materials developed from Ethan's testimony have been used by child welfare agencies in 23 states. They emphasize several key points: that children, even young children, can provide valuable insight into their own best interests, that sibling bonds formed through shared trauma are often stronger than typical sibling relationships, that difficult behavior from foster children is frequently a symptom of trauma rather than an inherent character flaw, and that keeping siblings together, even when challenging, should be the default unless there's clear evidence that separation is necessary for safety. Rebecca Chen, the attorney who decided to put Ethan on the stand despite the risks, has become a sought-after speaker on children's voices in family court. She's training the next generation of family law attorneys to listen more carefully to what children are actually saying, to recognize that even young children can be competent witnesses to their own experiences, and to fight harder for sibling placements. Ethan taught me that sometimes the most powerful legal argument isn't in a case precedent or a statute, she says in her presentations. The Carsons, whose request for sole placement of Ethan initiated this entire court proceeding, have expressed regret about their decision. In a statement they provided to a family services journal, they wrote, "We believed we were acting in Ethan's best interest by wanting to remove him from what we perceived as his sister's negative influence. But we failed to understand that Sophie wasn't the source of Ethan's struggles. She was the reason he'd survived them. We've since received additional training in trauma-informed care and sibling dynamics. It was a gracious admission of error and a testament to their genuine care for children, even when they'd initially misunderstood what those children needed. Today, Sophie is 17 and Ethan is 11. They still live with the Johnsons, who are in the process of adopting them. Sophie has expressed that she wants to keep her last name, Matthews, because despite everything, it represents her identity and her connection to her brother. Ethan has said he wants to be Ethan Johnson Matthews, keeping both names as a symbol of his dual identity, who he was and who he's becoming. The adoption should be finalized by early 2025, giving both children the legal permanency they've never had. Sophie has started talking about college. She's interested in social work or counseling, wanting to help other kids who've been through trauma similar to hers. Her grades have improved dramatically. She's made a few close friends who know her whole story and accept her anyway. She still has bad days. Trauma doesn't heal on a predictable timeline, but she's learning to ask for help instead of carrying everything alone. And she's learning that being Ethan's sister doesn't mean she has to be his parent anymore. They can just be siblings now, with adults handling the adult responsibilities. Ethan is thriving academically and socially. He's in the 6th grade now, plays on 2 soccer teams, and has been selected for his school's gifted and talented program. He still counts to 17 when he's anxious, but he needs to do it less frequently. He still has nightmares occasionally, but Linda has taught him grounding techniques that help. And he still believes that Sophie is the strongest person he knows. "People think I saved Sophie by testifying," he said in a recent interview for a child welfare documentary. "But Sophie saved me first." The Matthews siblings' story isn't a fairy tale. Their parents' addiction caused real harm that will affect them for the rest of their lives. The foster care system almost separated them in a way that would have compounded that trauma. And even now, with stability and support and therapy, they're still working through pain that children should never have to experience. But their story is also a testament to the resilience of sibling bonds, to the power of speaking truth even when you're just a kid, and to the possibility that systems can change when they're forced to listen to the people they're supposed to serve. If you're watching this and you work in child welfare, foster care, or family law, here's what I want you to take away. Listen to the children. Not just as a procedural checkbox, but as a genuine source of wisdom about their own needs. Ethan was 10 years old and he understood his sister's trauma, their mutual dependence, and the necessity of their bond better than any of the adults making decisions about their lives. How many other children in the system right now could provide similar insight if we just asked them? How many siblings are being separated because adults assume they know what's best without consulting the children themselves? If you're a foster parent or considering becoming one, understand that difficult children are usually traumatized children. Sophie's behavioral problems weren't a character flaw. They were survival mechanisms developed in an environment where adults couldn't be trusted. With the right support, patience, and understanding of trauma, those behaviors can heal. Don't give up on the complicated kids. They're the ones who need you most. And if you're a sibling, biological or chosen or found through shared circumstances, take care of each other. Not in a way that makes you sacrifice your own well-being, but in a way that recognizes the unique bond you share. Sophie and Ethan survived because they had each other. This story went viral because it touched something universal. We all understand the love between siblings who've survived hardship together. We all recognize the courage it takes for a child to stand up for what they know is right. We all want to believe that systems can be moved by truth spoken with conviction. Share this video if it moved you. Share it if you think more people need to hear Ethan's story. Share it if you believe that children's voices matter in decisions about their own lives. Drop a comment telling me about your own siblings, or about a time when someone stood up for you, or about your experiences with the foster care system. I want to hear from you. This conversation is too important to end here. Hit that like button if you believe that family, however you define it, is worth fighting for. Subscribe to this channel because we tell stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, about systems that need changing and individuals brave enough to change them, and about the kind of love that refuses to accept easy answers when the right answer requires courage. Ethan Matthews was 10 years old when he stood up for his sister. He had no legal power, no official authority, no credentials except his own experience of what Sophie meant to him. But his words changed the trajectory of 2 lives, influenced legislation in multiple states, and reminded everyone in that courtroom why they dedicated their careers to protecting children. Sometimes the most powerful voice in the room belongs to the smallest person in it. Let's make sure we're listening.